Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
Today we're talking with Anneke Lucas. Anneka is an author, speaker and advocate for human trafficking victims. Anneka is the author of Quest for Love, which describes some of her experiences of being sold into sex slavery at the age of 6 to be abused by an elite paedophile network comprised of members of the ruling class of society. And whilst the theme of the book is very dark, actually, Anneka, I think you've found a way to tell your story which is very engaging and makes it possible to read about the events with a sense of hopefulness through that. So yes, thank you. Anneka is also founder of Liberation Prison Yoga and developed a mindfulness modality, the Unconditional model. Whilst Anneka's childhood experiences are difficult to hear about, Anneka offers us an inspirational story of hope and recovery. Really delighted you could join us today. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hello, Anneka. Very nice to meet you, and thanks very much for coming along this morning / afternoon. So, Anneka, can you tell us a bit about your family background? How did you come to be in contact with this elite paedophile network?
Yes, thank you. So my mother had me single in 1963, so it was quite unusual at that time for women to be single mothers. And she was certainly not well mentally. She was 24 when she had me, so not that young. And then when I was 3, she married, and then we moved to Flanders, and my stepfather was extremely absent. And initially, a cleaning lady came and then offered, my mother had my brother when I was 4, and then this cleaning lady showed up when I was 5, and then immediately offered to take me with her and her husband. And there were always lots of other children there as well. It was a little strange. And after a year of them taking me regularly on outings, which, by the way, I never wanted to go. I didn't like them. But yes, they nevertheless took me, taught me to swim, everything. And then after a year, they basically took me to an event that was horrific right away. I was 6 years old, or just 6. I was just between 5 and 6. And it was extreme. And I was also immediately threatened to not speak about anything in an extremely graphic way. I tried to tell my mother anyway. And then I don't know how it happened, but my mother ended up being the person that was taking me and that was receiving money. And that was then also in direct contact with this countess who apparently was the contact person. So the cleaning lady, I actually believe that I spoke French when we moved to Flanders. I didn't speak English. I didn't speak Flemish. But that was also because the caretaker in the first years was French speaking. We were in Brussels, which is bilingual. So I spoke the language of my caretaker, not my mother, who's Flemish. And I didn't speak any Flemish. So I was put next to a girl from the nobility who spoke French, because they all speak French, and then also Flemish. And then I was in her home several times. And this, I have a feeling that through that family, I ended up being targeted, or my family was then targeted, because my mother would have been a profile where you can actually get a child from that woman, because she wasn't going to say anything. And in fact, she ended up participating.
Sounds like a terrifying period in your life, Anneka. And clearly there was this very long grooming before you were introduced. And then you mentioned that your mother was then involved with taking you along. Did you ever have the opportunity to talk about this with your mother?
My mother had an idea of herself that she was a really good mother. So anything that came in the way of that was not allowed. And that's where she became extremely tyrannical. That kind of narcissism, that even when there were clear signs that physical signs of abuse that were either bruises, or I limped once because I had been stabbed, or even big crusts from having been wounded. For my mother, none of that existed. And if I limped, I was just pretending, because nothing could happen that was bad to me because it would reflect on her mothering. So she was the perfect mother. So in terms of confrontation, it was so hard to speak to her at all that I did confront her in writing, and I confronted her further when she wanted to, at one point she decided she wanted to contact again, and we were not in contact anymore. So I confronted her further in writing, and she's not rooted in reality, really, my mother. So there really was nothing to say. I mean, she actually responded as when I was an adult and I told her that she had been driving me to these horrific events, that she thought that she was taking me for sleepovers with the parents of my friend. So she, as much as admitted that she was taking me to strangers' places at night, except that she also was getting paid, and she would drop me off at the side entrance, and but she, even as she was driving me to these events, it's not like she allowed herself to know in that moment what the consequence of that was going to be for me. I'm not sure if it's that denial was so great that not only could I never get anywhere with her during the time that this was happening, but also afterwards, there really was no common ground really to agree to even have the confrontation.
You're highlighting something really important there, aren't you, about how people end up facilitating and enabling abuse of children, though, and by switching, closing their eyes to very obvious signs that something's deeply, deeply amiss and choosing not to allow that information to, it should have been obvious, but you can see how someone who's perhaps avoidant in nature switches off to that kind of information.
Well, my mother was very active because she did drive me and she was receiving money, but my stepfather was completely avoidant. So I tried to tell him once when I was a child, I wrote that in my book, by the way, that things were happening. It was not what my mother was telling him. And he didn't believe me then. And then later in life, he did want to believe me, but that was just because they had divorced. And he just wanted to gossip about my mother, basically. But he never allowed in, never allowed in what this means, what this meant. He started to change. He started to say that you went to parties rather than that I was abused at orgies, a very different context that he was giving to it to minimize everything drastically, because he also couldn't see his own responsibility there.
Thank you. And it certainly sounds like there was a very high level of organisation among this network in preparing victims for their role as, sex slaves. Can you tell us a bit more about what this entailed?
Yes, sure. So in Belgium, it wasn't that organized, although I think in the network, they really know trauma very well. So they use trauma the trauma reactions are actually exploited completely and evoked in order to have this mind control, to do the mind control on the victims. So in Belgium, we were being indoctrinated, but it was a little bit more haphazard, you could say. But the result is still very impactful to a child, obviously. So I was told at 6 years old, I was taught how to treat the men. And I was told that I should make them feel comfortable and that they were new. And so I had to be like a little mother prostitute to these adult men that were supposedly doing this for the first time. And this was, of course, to tape it for blackmail purposes. So I had to also position them, you see, as a 6-7-year-old child. I had to position them so that because the camera was hidden and I knew where it was, and I had to position them to make sure that they would have the material on them, why this was supposedly done. And of course, these men, and in Belgium too, they were very good at triaging the people that were coming into these through secret societies and so forth into this club, you could say, triaging those people that were going to be open to, pedophilia and those that weren't. And those that were not open to pedophilia, I didn't come across them. They would have been, blackmailed in other ways. But pedophilia was definitely the most common way that people were being blackmailed. And then they were also rewarded, though. It's not just that they were being blackmailed now, it's that they were actually rewarded with position. And this is how it worked. So the power maintains itself by getting these people that are all compromised. And the worse you are, the worse psychopaths got ahead the most. So that's how it works. And that's how it works on every level. And then at 9 years old, I was then given to what I called the global network, which were more powerful networkers with, billionaire, well-known billionaires and so forth. And then these people, there was a level of organization there that was very impressive. And I think to this day is very impressive, where I was first triaged by the person himself, by the man who was going to make me his own elite slave. And then there was a whole protocol. And then I was literally sent from the United States, because I was taken from Belgium. I was flown out to the United States where this perpetrator lived. And I was triaged by him personally. Then he had to get permission. That was all part of this protocol, where I had to even as a 9-year-old give my will. And then afterwards, I was sent to Germany, to Heidelberg, to what looked like a mansion, a villa from the outside, very close to the ruins of the castle of Heidelberg. Mostly in the basement there was basically a facility, a smaller facility, but I was trained there in which you could only call trauma-based mind control. The tactics used there were both extreme and extremely effective, with very precise results.
What are you meaning exactly, Anneka?
So there were different parts to this training, and maybe 4 major parts. They're called alpha, beta. The alpha training has to do with the physicality, so it's kind of don't force sports, but that was sort of on the side. As a sex slave, I was being trained very specifically with films, forced, being tied up, and actually in chains in a special kind of chair, and then my eyes pried open to watch certain movies that were showing men, like to guess at men's sexual perversions. I had to look at these there's a screen, these films, where you would see the face of a man, and then you would see him engaging in his particular perversion, and then I would be shown the face of a man and have to guess what he liked. And if at first I had found a way to sort of blur everything and not really see what was happening on the screen because it was so horrendous, it was really horrific. And if I couldn't really tell at first, then I was either being suffocated or drowned, which then was a punishment, but it was also done with such precision and, as if the person in charge there knew exactly how long he could keep me underwater so that I would pass out. I would have a near-death experience. My spirit would leave my body, and I would then become more intuitive and be able to get the answers right more quickly. That was the other side of that training, of that punishment. And I noticed how I was changing when I was there. This was one part of the training. There were maybe 4 major parts to it. There was the sex slavery, which was recognizing men's sexual perversions immediately, so that you bypass the conscious mind and you just intuitively or instinctively know. The second was to see their weaknesses. So that was another round of films with the same system. In between, I was electrocuted and I was screamed at, repetitively screamed at, seeing men's sexual perversions. In between, I was tied to a chair that went back, and I had the handlers screaming over my head that I was a whore, repeating that very loudly and aggressively, and while I was being electrocuted. And the electrocution was used a lot also, so it was a lot on my head, but also connecting to points on the body, and I don't really know fully the purpose of it, but I know that I was changing rapidly during that time. I also had a part of the training there it's called the Delta programming, which most mind control slaves would undergo, which is about killing, and then psychic opening the psyche very specifically, and then doing very specific things, they find your ways in which we all have some psychic ability, so they find particularly the way, and then they do everything to completely open that. And in my case, that this was done by putting me in a salt water tank, a sense deprivation tank. Salt water, except salt water so deep that I had to stay awake. So in this state of floating and needing to relax by force and floating for what seemed like days, having to stay awake, it brings you into these completely different states. And I've learned since that the weightlessness itself also makes you more psychic. And then I was given tasks, psychic tasks. And that was sort of the beginning of a year of, it was a month. I was there for a whole month in Heidelberg. And this is the summer of 1972. And I was 9 years old. I was gone from home for 2 months, the whole summer, and back for school the next year. But that year, from, September 1972 to April of 1973, I was taken a lot, either for more training or more specific things. And then also already, you can say, deployed as a sex slave, as an elite sex slave with prominent politicians.
Well, this is a real horror story, isn't it, Anneka? And you seem to be suggesting earlier on that you think this still goes on. Is that right?
Well, there's nothing been done to end it. So it's a conglomeration of power, hogging, power, money, control. So unless we are aware and we end it by our, first, I think our awareness, then you cannot tolerate, the problem with it is that it is so horrendous that it is very difficult to absorb. And I'm very aware of that. That information seems so outlandish. And this is their biggest protection, of course, the extreme nature of their own actions. And I think that in general, we don't really understand this psychopathy very well. And if people stop thinking that the people that we see on the screen are like us, I think we've come a long way in that generally narcissism is so much better understood now. And clearly everything is shifting and changing, and it's only changing in one direction. But the extreme nature of their actions, some of them by their own psychopathy, but they're psychopaths that you can say have been created because their own children are abused. And incest is normalized in these circles of when you go really high, even when you go in the art world and you get at the top levels of any kind of field, almost, you find that either sexual abuse is hidden and incest is normalized. And that's how it was. And we're now talking about it was from 69 to 74. So the 70s was an era where pedophilia, there was a very big push to normalize pedophilia then as well. And a lot of men a lot of people, I could say, were accepting that as if it were normal because it was being shoved down our throats through the media. So much of the media at that time was very pedophilic, and there was no outcry.
No, I can remember that time. So, Anneka, you mentioned just then that power, money, and control are what comes to play in these activities in this organisation. And I think it's important to keep that firmly in mind, really. I mean, earlier on I used the term elite group. I don't think they really are elite. That somehow is aggrandising them a bit, because it is all to do with power, money and control.
And that control, and this is what, I saw as a little girl even, I felt as a little girl that I was stronger than them. And that's because the first time I was taken, I spoke out against them. And that's why I was threatened, because I threatened them. And I threatened to expose them the very first time I was taken to this horrific event, because I had been so humiliated that I felt that if I'm not going to do something, I will die inside. and I will be lost and I will become like them. So I stood up and I said, you can't do this to me. I'm going to make sure that you're all going to go to jail for this. And then afterwards, I was graphically threatened. But that little thread, that little rebel was my sort of the thread to healing ultimately. And I work with survivors today, and the people that I love to work with, and most of them are, the reason that we are here now is because we didn't go along. We didn't give in. We didn't give up. And I think hope is essential there, that there was this little knowing that, and at times that would have meant, now I'm going to die, but I'd rather die. I'd rather die than give in to that. And I'm not saying that I didn't get pulled in very, very deep, because that's the whole point. The tactics are really very sophisticated to make sure that you're going to do what they want you to do. And you have no choice. You never have a choice. That's what's so tragic. But ultimately, those people that want that power, money, and control, that need that, it's because their own lack of self-esteem. So we have the weaklings that are trying to keep the control over people that are generally, if we have this sense of morality is innate. Now, what I met were a lot of children who thought that they were rebelling against Catholicism. A lot of them were Catholics, for example, in their regular life. They were religious people. There were bishops. I mean, I saw bishops in this setting. But whatever, it's like their own trauma has made them feel so hopeless and helpless inside that everything that represents normal life, with the normal moral living and making choices every day, living everyday life, is completely empty for them. Because if they wouldn't have something to secretly make them come to life, which just goes in the shadows, their front life is a complete cover, and it's completely empty, because if they had to live just that life, they would be so depressed, they would probably all kill themselves. Because the depression of just living normal life, they would be confronted. If you try to live a good life, you're confronted with your shadows. They come somehow, they come and catch up with you. So what they've done, and how this becomes satanic, because it's a reversal, is that the front life is all image. And so there's a lot of money that goes to the PR to create this image for the masses, which is always proving that they're good people. But in the shadows, that's to say in secret, when you have an incest situation, what happens is that the incest perpetrator will have this excitement, and that there's this secret thing, and there's this secret fun, and that is basically the key to all of this that happens in the shadows. That in secret, that's where the fun happens, because that initially that child that was innocent and a being of light got very strongly through incest or through sexual abuse, got the message that they're not worthy of just being loved for who they are, just for existing. That the only way that they can be loved and they can have fun is by being a sexual being, which is completely premature, of course, for all these children. So what I met were a lot of adult men with extreme need for power and control, because they were constantly running away from their own trauma and the lie that their perpetrators were right. So they're trying to prove by perpetuating this that their perpetrators were right. And all the science that really goes into this is completely separated from the heart.
But as you're talking about the front, for instance, you see that in much lower key perpetrators, don't we? So the people hiding as school teachers, scoutmasters, priests, humanitarian aids workers, there is this front to conceal in order to gain access to vulnerable people. And it sounds like you're referring also to, we've also interviewed a lot of boarding school survivors and discussed how that damages potentially the leaders of society when they, with the trauma of being sent away from home at a very early age. But if you seem to be talking about families where there's a systemic involvement in a system of paedophilia, which goes way beyond just the incest within the family, but also a much broader network, and the trauma then just gets perpetuated, and it's a very closed group of people, presumably.
Yes, who also want to perpetuate their values, or their lack of values rather, on the whole world with their money and power through their channels and where they have the control. The media, a lot of the media, and a lot of, and all of this seems to be falling apart, by the way, right now, but still.
Although not quickly enough. I was just reminded as you were talking about the blackmail, about Jeffrey Epstein, and heard his niece being interviewed, and actually she had a story which is very similar to yours in some way. So although that's not all part of Jeffrey Epstein's, the allegations of the story of Jeffrey Epstein, it does seem as though what we see is kind of the tip of the iceberg, really,
Exactly.
in terms of that story.
Absolutely. And what I'm noticing now is that even the alternative media that is talking a lot about Jeffrey Epstein, they still have to keep the focus on the older teens, or, I don't understand the historian coming to say that Jeffrey Epstein was attracted to older teens. How would any historian know about that? That's, that, and then everybody seems to agree on that, and then really focusing on Israel and the Mossad, which, the Mossad is obviously working for somebody also, that, the focus seems to be not so much on the reality that children from birth are abused and indoctrinated. And yes, very young children are used. And in that circle also raped. And when we speak of Satanism, then, again, this is through the means of the very people that abused me, completely ridiculed in the mainstream media. The idea of Satanism gets ridiculed, or maybe, the idea of the more extreme things that they do is completely ridiculed. But Satanism, the philosophy of Satanism, is exactly that reversal that I just described on a psychological level. Then you're going to be following that. You're going to be following Aleister Crowley, and, the idea, do as thou wilt. That do as thou wilt then becomes just do the most heinous, commit the most heinous crimes without consequence, supposedly. So there is a religion behind it, and that then just fortifies the unhealed trauma, the psychopathy especially, just going deeper and deeper. What people generally don't understand is that to these people that are involved in this, and obviously that's not everybody, that's certain people that are involved in this, and then some more than others. I think a lot of people are caught in it without really wanting the negative parts, but they've been bought in, through whatever means of blackmail, or for the sake of their position, or whatever. But the reversal is the psychological reversal creates this, that the trauma that isn't healed creates a person for whom nothing means anything anymore. And yet everything they do is absolutely symbolic of their own inner state. So the chaos they create and the harm they create is an absolute reflection of their own inner states, of the little parts that are victimized, that then have to die, or the little parts in them that have to suffer because they can't get to them and heal them in the proper way. And they keep, I like parts work because they keep in what I call controller parts. You will see only someone who's also shown on the world stage. You'll see either a part that is controlling, that is in control, or either you'll hear about a part that is escaping, but you'll never get a sense of the truly greater self, which is the spiritual aspect, or you'll never get a sense of the true victimization. And then sometimes when somebody gets caught, they immediately go in a victim mode, and then you get these little victim parts, but they're not connected to the true victimization. They're connected to their situation, their circumstances, where they are being tried to be made accountable or something. And then you get this sort of complaints from somebody who feels victimized when they've had so much privilege and power.
Such a horrific account to listen to. And I guess it is so horrific that it becomes beyond believable to many people. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about how we titrate things in such a way as to enable people to begin to believe some of this?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's really important to feel everything. It takes courage for us survivors to heal, to go back to these moments of fear of death where we emotionally don't even know that we're going to live this time, but we go back anyway. So it takes a lot of courage to even hear this, because you can hear it without feeling and then it becomes sensationalism. But you really need to feel it with feeling. You need to absorb it with feeling. And I think that a lot of people, it would make them feel extremely helpless and powerless and depressed. And I think that is initially necessary and a good thing. And I believe that everybody has to look at themselves. I think everyone needs to heal. But if you look at the world today, then what else than truth is the only explanation really for the way things are today. Everybody accepts that politicians are corrupt, but yet so many people believe that you still have to go out and vote. And that there's every time it's the same story, and in the United States, it's very basic. It's just two parties, left or right. And there's all the same. It's all the same. So I think that this reality, and the reality even of sexual abuse itself often, but the reality of child sexual abuse itself, but also the reality of this, it will challenge your worldviews. So obviously that means that you have to go inside. It's very challenging. And I thought a lot about that, because that's really what the unconditional model that I created is really about. Is a way for people to go inside and basically look at our own inner power dynamics, how we continue to give power to certain kinds of people, depending on our, original authority figures, or how we put ourselves above others through judgment as, like, say, an acceptance, intolerance as the smallest form of downward projection. That these are strands of the same things that we have in this hierarchy that we have today, this hierarchic system that puts the sickest people on the top. And if we go and I don't think anyone's served by this, by the way. I don't think these people should be allowed to rule over us, because they're not capable, obviously. So we need to trust our own inner wisdom and power to not give our power away, whether it be through a vote or anything else. That we need to know ourselves. And so on a very personal level, using these power dynamics as a way into our own unresolved trauma, then you say, okay, when I give my power away to someone, it comes from, there's fear behind that. There's a what if I didn't placate this person, for example. And that is the way into looking at, who from your childhood, maybe, who does this person remind you of from childhood? When you feel like this, it's not just admiration, but when you feel yourself feeling, you have to look at your own feelings. Do you feel uncomfortable? Do you feel like you just want to love this person and do everything for them? What is going on inside of you when you give your power away to someone? What kind of person is that? How does that relate to your childhood? And then, as I said, I really like parts work, because then we ultimately we want to get to the original, what we call exiles, in parts work, to really get to what happened, and to go to the psychological origin of any kind of projection.
It sounds, Anneka, like you've come up against quite a lot of sadism, actually, in your childhood, and I wondered what sense you made of the concept of no bad parts.
Yeah, I think sadism is a controller part that sees the pain in someone else and feels the relief of that not being yourself. I think that's what sadism is. So very young, emotionally very young part that is just so happy that they themselves don't have to experience that humiliation and that pain.
There's a lot of compassion in you to be able to think about this from that kind of perspective, because a lot of people get stuck, I think, with their own histories of victimisation. It can be hard to think more holistically, and something quite special, I think, about the fact that you have been able to reflect on the psyche of people that have committed these kinds of harms against you. I wondered what...
It's compassion, but let's not be confused, because not you, but I don't want anyone to get confused and think that I'm tolerating any of this.
No, I wasn't suggesting that, but I suppose I was curious about how your healing journey started.
Well, it's been going on since the 80s. So it started young. I was just unfortunately, I was getting flashbacks and I couldn't make sense of them. And my therapist wasn't open. I mean, I went to therapy early on because, well, I had a lot of programming. I had programming on the one hand to become an elite sex slave. But then when I rebelled, I got programming that is called discard programming to make sure I would never have any kind of success and I would just sort of die of drug overdose or something. And I ended up being rescued from somebody from within the network who gave me, I think, guided but very specific instructions to go against that discard programming. So I ended up living my life very small, feeling extremely worthless and bad and definitely promiscuous, but also with these little, once in a while, there was definitely things from the programming, from various programming that were coming out, which is completely chaotic or confusing. And it's not like my life was going well. So I went to therapy and I immediately started working on sexual abuse. And that was the beginning of the facing truth. And then that journey took me to find a therapist 10 years later that could handle the flashbacks. And every time, I guess there's so many little parts in me that were humiliated, that were compromised, that were, because the hardest part of what happens in the network, I think, and the hardest to heal is that you are made to harm new victims or other victims. And that's why it's so hard to get out. That's how people are compromised, is you either become a pedophile, but it goes farther. And my own training as a child, and I know this is very outlandish and hard to believe, but again, think psychopathy where nothing means anything anymore. And you're creating a system of power where what is the best way to make sure that a child that you are horribly abusing, that they are never going to speak out? Well, same as with everybody. You compromise them. And that means that, even in Belgium, I said it wasn't as sophisticated, but I was taken to a farm with other children and all of us had to murder a little animal. And there's no choice. And they pretend to give you a choice. And of course, there is no choice. So we are being made to do harm. And that is a very big part of the program, so that we're never going to speak out because we feel that we're the bad guys. And so I had a tremendous guilt complex. And the worthlessness really comes from doing the harm. Even as a child, even though it was coerced, you don't know that it was coerced anymore because your hormones, your survival states, you don't know that this was coerced as a child. You could never sort that out. You have to have an adult to come and tell you initially, that the compassion for the child in that situation, you need that viewpoint from the adult to say, you didn't want that. You didn't know, but you were just trying to survive. So it goes so far in these circles that, of course, it makes it very difficult. They want the children to become part of this network as well. So there was a big push to make me part of this network, which eventually failed. And then I was reprogrammed to make sure I would never speak, or I would, quietly kill myself in some way or other, that I would never speak. It's all about never speaking. And in fact, when I was a child, I was always thinking, man, you put so much attention and effort on me not speaking out. And I was thinking, why would I ever speak out? This is crazy. I would never say anything. I'm so ashamed. I thought, I was being told I was a whore when I was 6 years old. So I was not going to go to school and tell people that actually I'm a whore, in the weekends. I was not going to do that. I was so ashamed. And then when you're being forced to do harm, then you're so ashamed. And in fact, when you take a life, I think that's the greatest trauma. You could never bring it back. So to heal from that, really the only way to heal from that, and you can heal from even taking a life, is that you really need to connect in a very personal way with spirit. And I think the journey to truth leads everybody to spirit. That if you follow truth, you're already on a spiritual path, because that's not common in this world. In this world, there's a lot of pressure to belong here or to belong there, and there's some group think. But if you really follow truth and you want your own truth, that's to say your own trauma and your own blind spots and your own dark, face that. It always comes out to fear, some fear. And of course, trauma is fear of death. And we go back to our fears, we overcome our fears. But without spirit, you could never really overcome fear. But also, you could never overcome the fact that you've taken a life. And this is not a bypass in any way. I promise you, it's not a bypass. But that you have to have the perspective that there's more to life than the physical.
Sounds, Anneka, like it was really hard to find a therapist who could work with you, who was able to manage that. What advice do you have for therapists? A lot of therapists listen to this program. What advice would you give to make it possible for people to get the kind of help they need?
Well, I work with a lot of therapists now. That's my unconditional model. I teach it to mostly therapists and providers, actually, just because the problem that I had, and it's really to change, things for people coming after me, because it was so hard for me, that, as I said, these things will hit on your own worldview, which comes out of your own experience. So that means that it's going to awaken some of your own trauma. So any kind of strong negative reaction that you have to a client, well, obviously you're projecting now. So then you have to go look at yourself. It requires a lot of humility and a lot of willingness to be present with whatever comes. And I would say privately, you don't necessarily have to believe this person, but you do have to be able to create this container that you're not brainwashed to think it's ridiculous and not possible, for example, because that's brainwashing too. That's you being brainwashed. So you have to watch yourself all the time when you're with clients. And it's that you just have to, hopefully you're humble and open and willing to learn from your clients. And I say this, my model with power projections and looking at power projections, if you're a therapist who needs to be needed, for example, that's already a way in which you are, with the best intentions, though, have your ego present there. That what if you have somebody who doesn't need you? And then does that trigger you? So it's a way of looking at yourself and going into your own unresolved stuff that will really enable you to be fully present with your clients. Because most therapists that I've found, they were in it for their own purposes, that was really covering their own unresolved trauma. They needed the status or the expertise to be the one in charge in the room. There's a lot of therapists that really love to see the vulnerability of their clients, but they'll never show their own. It takes a lot of humility and a lot of willingness to work on yourself. And it's sort of like a different paradigm, it's not, and thankfully more and more people are very much like this. But when I was in the 80s, when I started therapy, yes, my first long-term therapist was not open to the network, and she was also not open to anything relating to my mother because of her own issues, clearly, with her mother. So then I went looking, and I saw many, many, many people before I found the therapist that I was able to work with. When I knew that what I was looking for, I knew that I'm not making this up. This is not my sick fantasy. These are flashbacks. There's something there. I don't know what, but I have to find out. then it took me a very long time. I saw a lot of crazy therapists in my search for a therapist that either took things for granted, or one person said, I don't necessarily believe you. and, so obviously I would never say that. Sometimes I have people I don't know if I can believe them or not because their motives aren't clear. But you're not going to say that. You're just going to create space. You're not there to judge anyway. It's there to create space first and then see if you can get anywhere with someone. And I do that personally. I do that with the fact that I have the experience. So it's different. I'm not a compassionate therapist who has never been through what my client has been through. I've been through it myself. And so because I've been there, I know where they are. But I think this trauma goes deeper than any other trauma, you could say. And it is also a template for all trauma. So there's places to relate on every level, I believe.
Thinking as you were talking about the, being made to kill, and even with people who've killed of their own volition in prison, it's quite common for people to experience PTSD as a consequence of their own actions. But I think, that disconnection of the person from their integrity as a person is one of the things that's hardest for them, to try and recover that back after having committed an act like that. And so it resonates a lot with what you're talking about. These are the men that I've worked with, weren't forced to kill. That was usually something they had done being out of control. But actually there was still this sense of loss of integrity as a human being to when you're committing those kind of acts. I'm aware of one of the things that you've done, which is a really positive contribution besides the work that you do with human trafficking victims, is you have worked in prisons, actually. And I wonder if you would like to say something about that work before we finish.
Thank you. Yes, it was very, very beautiful work. A lot of trauma in prisons, obviously, and bringing yoga and meditation. But sometimes we just listened, And this is where I developed the unconditional model, because it was very clear to me the way that you're taught to teach yoga is you just give one command after another. So obviously, if I'm going to go into a prison, I'm not going to use commands, which is what prisoners hear all day long. So I thought I was going to meet my perpetrators. Instead, I met myself. I met myself as a child being treated as the lowest of the low, being completely seen as non-human. That's what I found. And I found beautiful people with a lot of trauma. And in various prisons also, we were in maximum security prisons for women, for men, minimum security, Rikers Island, which is really jails. So in the United States, there's this system that if you can't pay bail, you are thrown in jail until you're actually charged. So these are people that just are poor and can't afford bail, and they might be there for a misdemeanor. So it's very beautiful work, because I did feel very much that often I was just there to give hope. Seeing somebody in the hallway and you smile at them and you just realize that this smile meant the world to them, because they clearly hadn't had anybody just genuinely smile at them for a long time. And you feel it, you feel, or just meeting somebody in the hallway, that happened a lot, and just very quickly talking, I have so much pain, I'm in so much pain, and just very, very briefly sitting with them and just being with them in their pain. It was so beautiful to be able to share my healing in that way, and also break through the obvious privilege barriers, that I would be, that you break through that very quickly but, for me, sometimes I had to tell them about my history, because obviously I look rich and I look white, and I'm privileged in that way. So just to break through that quickly, I've used my privilege to heal. And then I was sharing that, and that was such a beautiful experience. And the yoga, meditation, for the men, it was more the yoga exercise and the physicality of it, because a lot of athletes were doing yoga. So the men got on board that way. And that's not to say that I didn't meet both pedophiles or, very aggressive people in the prison. And in one instance, there was a situation that could have been very dangerous because Rikers Island, anyway, you're in a room, but then you go through the dorm. And my student, my very big student, was right behind me. But as I was coming out, a man was looking at me, and he was looking at me in a way that was extremely scary, dangerous, because we were close. I was coming out, he was right there. And my student was right behind me, and he said, "Don't look down," because I was inclined to just look down, which would have meant submission. I had to look him in the eye and go past him. My student sensed that and helped me in that moment. And so there's a lot of beauty everywhere, And I never found any one of my perpetrators in the prison.
They're not there. That's why. Yes. So, Anneka, you very courageously told us about some of your horrific experiences, and you've touched upon your somewhat rocky journey through therapy, and that's been wonderful to hear. How do you keep yourself well balanced, psychologically balanced these days? What do you do to keep yourself going?
Yes, actually, I'm quite a happy person because I feel completely in alignment with what is wanted from me. Like when I was young and I would have been told this is what you're going to do in your life, I would have said, no, thank you. I don't think I want that. I would never want that from an ego place. But there came a point in my healing, so I have to say for 20 years, it was extremely difficult and a lot of suffering and feeling all the heaviness and the pain of what was done to me and what was also heaped on me, you could say, because that's what the victims are for, is to heap all your unresolved trauma to just temporarily put it with the victim so that you in that moment don't have to feel it. So if I'm not going to go that route, I never have that temporary relief. So I felt it. And it was very, very painful, and I suffered greatly. And it was very difficult to get through the day. And again, thank you for the privilege that I had, because I was able to do this, to focus on healing, and I didn't have to go to work for a while. That was through my marriage. Then there came a point where I was still having memories. I was still dealing with things, and it's still difficult, but I wasn't really suffering anymore. It was as if all the tears had been shed. Not that I don't cry. Of course I cry, and I can cry in compassion very easily, but it was as if the tears had been shed. And at that point, I might cry for a second or 2 seconds instead of 3 days. And maybe the things that were coming were maybe even more difficult than the things that I cried for so long before. But I was able to handle it it was as if there was more grace there. And I'm working with, just like in the prisons, working now with other survivors. It's extremely beautiful to connect with someone who feels completely isolated and who may, feel that they have never been able to tell someone who believes them. That is extreme. I feel extremely honored to be in that position with that person. And I have a very active spiritual life. I serve in my meditation center. I make sure that I serve, that I'm always busy, and lead the meditations and with chants and everything. And somehow I feel that the magic of the healing and to allow in the greater truth, which is about the light and not the darkness, that there's an orchestration behind it, that I've been able to use both the things that I was trained for in the network to now, one of the things is that you get trained to look normal, which was always a benefit for me, that I could always look normal and not look heavily traumatized, which is now also being normalized, but that's something else. And yeah, those gifts that they pull out of you by force, I'm able to use them, like with the yoga, I was able to be beginning to be present with people. I was learning to be present with men and just absorb so much. And specifically that one little vulnerability, the one place in which they felt completely isolated and they felt they could never be understood and they were very lonely. and to feel that's their weakness in the network, to hone in on that, and then to give the impression that I'm understanding that, well, that I do that, that continues. I do that, but I do it with love, with real love and compassion, and it's fulfilling. And I feel that my own healing and lack of any kind of desire for revenge and everything really supports me. And, like I said, I chant, I was supposed to be a singer. Well, now I'm chanting spiritually. And that's healing, that singer. I didn't sing for 50 years. Now I'm chanting. And it's just so, I'm all my desires are fulfilled or transcended.
Thank you. And Anneka, if somebody wanted to do your training in your unconditional model, how would they find you?
The best way is to go to my website, which has everything. So it's annekalucas.com. And I have workshops there. They're already listed and slated for the next series that we're doing, the level 1 and level 2. And yeah, these are really lovely courses because for therapists, they're going to have the opportunity to meet other survivors, because there's a lot of survivors that are also in a provider role that are also present there for the courses. So it's really a collaboration. And we've done 3 level 1 courses, so they go over 10 weeks. And it's really, every time, it's a beautiful coming together. And yeah, the model is very specific, and I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud that my unique experience with the most powerful people on earth has given me this insight into power that can be used for our personal healing, with the ultimate purpose, I say, to change the world by changing ourselves.
Thank you so much, Anneka. That was a really powerful conversation. And do please thank your dogs for being so unobtrusive.
Will do.
Thank you, Anneka.